position. So this is another of the series on economic history as a discipline, and we have the chance of having Martin talking about something that we can maybe say that he knows quite well because of personal interest in Hirschman, but also for thesis work. And yeah, maybe some like logical announcement about the series in general. It will start again after in the new year, and I will send like a calendar with the new series in mid-January. So there will not be a first of the month in January, but it will start in February. So for the next one. And now I can leave you the floor, and we can have a bit of a discussion afterward. I know that there might be some people online, so I'll take the question also if there are any.
Okay.
So I think you're set up to go if you want.
Yeah. Hello. I was just about to start, but I start now then. Nice to be here. Thank you, Clara, for the invitation. We had a discussion, me and Clara, at some point on Hirschman, because it was part of the coursework that you did. And then I mentioned that that was kind of a academic hero for me, used to be. And you asked me after that if I could have a presentation on the works of Hirschman, and I accepted because I think his writing is very stimulating for discussion, and I also think that cross-disciplinarity, which is part of his signum, is I think something that is increasingly and important in the social sciences, and he was a good proponent and an advocate of that. So this will be a personal reflection on my readings of Hirschman. I read in the 90s. I've spent a lot of time in Latin America, and Hirschman was my guide to understanding Latin American economy. And I wrote a paper on it, and I read everything that he had written, but it was 25 years ago, and I haven't revisited so much. So I thank you for the opportunity to do it now. So Hirschman, I think just a short bio is that he, as a German Jew, he had to flee the Nazis via Italy and France, and he was working with the anti-fascist movement in France, hiding documents and moving over to be actively participating in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. He then moved over to or helped other European Jews to go to America, and he received a scholarship to go to America, and he was working in the military intelligence there. And after that, he was sent on as a policy advisor to Colombia in the 1950s, and that's when he started his career as a development economist. And after that, he had many positions on many of the Ivy League schools: Stanford, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, and ending up at Princeton School of Advanced Studies, where he stayed until his passing away, almost 100 years old in 2012. And he was relatively active until that time. And I think I should hit another button. There. So this is just my, we can just skim the surface, of course, of this, of Hirschman and his works. And I will talk a little bit about these 4 points: his research agenda, the major contributions of his work, his impact and impact today on social sciences, and a little bit on whether it's relevant for economic history today, which I think is the theme this series that you put together, Clara. So in terms of his research agenda, his preoccupation was to understand how social change can happen. Not so much how it has happened or how it should happen, but how it can happen. What are the possibilities for social change? That was the question that drove his scholarship, I think. But also why it did not happen. What are the hindrances to change? What are the reasons for why perception of change is limited? And he had his own expression for that, fracassomania, which was the failure complex that was typical of Latin America. In Latin America and Latin American society, there were many programs of change, but very little happened, and it was only it seemed to be standing on the same spot. And much of that, Hirschman argued, was due to the lack of perception of change, fracassomania. So that was one of the driving or the typical research interests. One reason for why perception of change is limited is due to economic theory and the assumptions that are involved, that are simplistic and limiting creativity, doesn't pay due attention to real change or the unexpected, that he was more concentrated in understanding rather than the expected. He didn't care so much about probabilities, but more about possibilities, and I will come back to that. And we must remember that Hirschman were active in the 50s. That was the era of big plans, development plans, grand social and economic policy programs rolled out by the big international organizations, World Bank and etc., and the Western world. And he thought that they were only signs of wishful thinking rather than any realistic idea of how change really happened. And the reason is that economic theory and economic models were limiting. And in order, and if one could say something about the idea, I mean, how an economic development strategy function is, instead of putting your hope to unrealistic grand programs, every country should work with what they have, not what they should have, but work with what you have. And since you cannot do everything at once, you should set priorities, and then you should go out and find the linkages that make those priorities a reality. So rather than, and that was on the contrary to how the development discussion was formed, which was of big push strategies, takeoff, big ideas, but and balanced growth, and I will come back to that. And so rather work with what you got, set priorities, and find the linkages that make it happen. And this required, and you couldn't be bounded by or limited by only economic thinking. You had to be inspired and take advantage of knowledge that were happening in other disciplines, in sociology, psychology, political science, and that was where he made his contribution in crossing boundaries and disciplinary boundaries. He shared with many development economists of the day the optimism. Development economics have always been, as opposed to economics in general, the dismal science, it's always been, I think, optimistic. How change can happen and what can be. I mean, that development is possible for the underdeveloped world, and he shared that. But as opposed to the the tradition of the day, he was advocating possibilism, and that became, if one should say something, if one can call a methodology, that he had a methodology of any kind, it was possibilism rather than probabilism, which was what economists were dealing with. By that he was a critic of the grand theories of the day, functionalism in sociology, modernization theory, structuralism, conflict theory, and these kind of big, often sociologic grand theories that endogenized everything. He was more of a middle-ranged theorizer, I think one could say. Part of his research agenda was very much focusing at the beginning on Latin America and Latin American development possibilities, stemming out of the fact that he was a policy advisor to the Colombian government in the mid-50s, and he wrote his big work, Strategy of Economic Development, as a reflection on that experience. And he became one of those scholars on Latin American economic development that you couldn't bypass, I think, and that was the focus of his attention. But later on, it became more general social science. So that's why one could say Latin America and beyond. And I think anti-fascism was part of his research agenda, based on what I mentioned earlier, his private encounters with fascism in Europe, but also the skepticism towards big plans, and always an attention to democracy and how to democratize not only, the mechanisms of democracy was part of his scholarly work throughout. So if that was, one could say, what I think is central aspects, but only a selection, of course, of his research agenda. In his work, he had many particularities, one can call it Hirschmanisms, and this is a selection of a few of those, that he often went into the unknown or stuff that were seldomly discussed. He were interested in the role of disappointment. And that, I think, also came from his experience in Latin America. People were disappointed all the time. And what did that mean? And how could that be understood when people took to the streets? What information does that entail in terms of communication to the leadership? Role of disappointment became one of the aspects that he thought that was forgotten in mainstream economics, but deserved to be understood. He didn't believe in the big development plans and big programs for change, and he thought that was an unrealistic way of understanding change. Change very much happened due to unintended consequences. We cannot plan the future. We cannot plan in detail, even if we want to. And policy prescriptions were often in that direction, to try to plan and design the future. That was a futile idea. It was rather the attention to unintended consequences that one should pay attention to. Often when policies were made, they could be blessings or curses in disguise. This was another typical thing of his to concentrate on. He were interested in hidden rationalities and the hiding hand. And the hiding hand, the principle of the hiding hand was that reality is there to be understood, but it's not evident to anybody. Actors are rational, but the perception of reality is like, hidden in a fist. And it can only be revealed when you open the fist and you try to understand reality by trial and typicality of Hirschman. He wrote, for instance, about the tunnel effect, which was a critique to the relative income hypothesis. For instance, that could be of relevance today in the discussion about inequality, tolerance for inequality. The relative income hypothesis says that there is an inverted relationship between your own well-being and the income of your peers. And he thought that it could very well be the other way around, that if your peers is improving, then there could be an expectation that you yourself could have a brighter future. So, and that was a typical Hirschmanian thinking. He always, thought, of the opposite of what was expected from economic theory. So this is just a short selection of typical analytical modes of thinking. So moving over into what I think is a few of the major contributions that he did, it was obviously the theory or idea of unbalanced growth. And this was completely at odds with the thinking of the time, which was based on balanced growth. Big push, Rosenstein, Rodan, Takeoff, Rostov, etc. And Hirschman thought that if a country has all that is required from making a big push, which was the major development idea of the time, then that country in itself couldn't be underdeveloped. So it was an unrealistic way of thinking of development, and it was also something that didn't provide any real recommendations for development. He thought that disruption, conflicts, rigidities, all of those things can be part of, spark off a creative and progressive change. And growth and development can never be across the board. It must start somewhere. And therefore, that will be create imbalances, and that imbalance is actually a definition of development in the first place. So I think that was perhaps one of the things that he's most well known for, and also something that lives on in the theory of development today and in the textbooks of development, I think. And connected to that was then the linkages effects that he wrote extensively about, and throughout his whole career. He started in the strategy of economic development, saying that it's the unbalanced growth will take place somewhere, and what policymakers should try to do is to make growth and change happen in places where there are linkages to other sectors of the economy. So the backward and the forward linkages, and later on consumer linkages and fiscal linkages, and all of those things could be activated. And this was kind of a extension of ideas that were already in existence, the growth pole of Perot, or the leading sector of discussion of Rostov, or input-output analysis that was very static. So this was something that had both a cross-sectional and a time-bound analysis to it, and it became something that he came back to throughout, extended this theory beyond the original forward and backward linkages to what the origin of this thinking. And this is, of course, something that is still something that people in development economics are very keen on knowing more of, and try to understand these linkages in greater detail. One should just mention here, I wrote agriculture in parentheses, and often, and if you read literature today on the role of agriculture for development, Hirschman is more often than not mentioned as an anti-agriculture proponent because allegedly agriculture has very little linkages to the rest of the to the society. That is not really an accurate statement. I think it is true that he didn't write a lot about the role of agriculture, and I think the role of agriculture and its linkages to development process is something that have been apparent in the literature and also in empirical studies of the last 2 or 3 decades. But he did write a lot about the differences between linkages in different staple production in Latin America. For instance, what are the linkages from coffee production vis-a-vis sugarcane staple production and corn and these kind of things. And he tried to understand. So it's not really accurate and fair to say that he was an anti-agriculturalist, I think. But it is true that he didn't pay so much attention to it. Major contribution is also within the, and very much so within the realms of the decision-making process in policy circles, what he called reform mongering. That was, if it was anything that developing countries were lacking, it was the reform mongering capacities. And that's something that that should be encouraged, very much so than anything else. And he wanted to understand the mechanisms of the decision making. And he wrote several books on this, and I can come back to that in the end. So that's a lasting contribution and a major contribution, perhaps very much so in other disciplines than economics, in management studies and sociology, and that's, you know, this is standard references to this day, I think. And perhaps the most important or most well-known book he wrote in the early 70s was Exit Voice Loyalty, where he tried to build bridges between I mean, this is the political economy. It's a political economy book par excellence, I think, and he wanted to build bridges between politics and understanding of politics and understanding of economics. And he thought, he stated that economics most often brings attention to exit. That's what consumers do. When they are disappointed or they are not fond of anything, they just stop buying or they exit. Whereas in politics, you use your voice. But he thought that it would provide better information to policymakers if there's the blend of exit and voice. And the idea allegedly came when he were in Nigeria, and they built up this great big and costly railway system. And although it was costly, it was inefficient, and people didn't use the railways, so they reverted back to their own vehicles and the road system. And he wondered why that was the case. And he thought that people were just using the exit option, exit from the railway station into a railway system into something else. But he wondered why, because one way of improving the system would have been that people would have raised their voices to inform policymakers how to improve the system instead of just exiting. And that became the start of the book of his Exit Voice Loyalty, and it's been used on many many circumstances or many situations to understand how to improve not only states but also in the corporate world. How can businesses use voice and exit in a combination to improve their performances? This is also a theme he came back to when with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of the Eastern Bloc, when people all of a sudden had a possibility to exit countries that they couldn't do, but that eventually turned into voice and people standing there and protesting against the regimes, and it became another, you know, for Hirschman that became evidence that there could be a mutual enforcement between exit and voice in understanding social change. Loyalty is also how it happened that people are loyal to products or companies or situations, even if they are malfunctioning. Yeah. In terms of impact, I think it's clear that his impact in development economics is the greatest, and it's still remaining. And I think some of the greatest or most influential development economists today, Daniel Roderick and others, pay very close, pays tribute to Hirschman still. In terms of political economy and other disciplines, political science, there are many awards and he's been receiving awards of the best political science or sociologist book of the year, and the Social Science Research Council, I think it's called, have this Hirschman Prize that goes out to famous recipients, Amartya Sen and Charles Tilly and Benedict Andersson and these kind of things. But one can say that his impact in those disciplines are, although that's very strong, his impact in economics is very limited, I would say. He started as an economist and that's where he is by trade, but his impact in economics proper is probably very limited. He's rather more famous for cross-disciplinary work and is used in very cross-disciplinary research, I think. One other thing that deserves to be mentioned is perhaps that he has the book also called A Propensity to Self-Subversion, and that's typical of him. He very often came back to his own ideas and revised them, extended them, or criticized them himself. So he's also a very hard scholar to follow blindly, at least, because he was self-critic much of the time. Yes. And in terms of economic history connections and what might be in it for economic historians today, I think his interest and writings about to understand change is something that all economic historians are dealing with, I guess. And strong attention and the importance of context in that. I think that is something that he shares with all of us. But he's not an economic historian that want to spend a lot of time to systematize empirics. He's not so much of a Kuznets-ian in finding general patterns and adding data to see if we can find a general empirical patterns. He's much more on bringing attention to the unexpected, to the things that is not apparent by the eye. And in terms of themes that he has made contributions that I think economic historians are still using, for instance, people that are working with the Hirschman-Herfindahl index would on calculating market concentration. That's something that he did early in the 40s. That is still in use, I think, for those. Maybe Jonas has been doing something on that, I think, or maybe not.
Jani
it was. He shared with Gerschenkron very much, and the Gerschenkron was also the one that I think invited Hirschman to America in the first place. Acts of substitution and the criticism of necessary prerequisites is something that is very much part and parcel of Hirschman ideas, and very much part and parcel of Gershon-Cronian economic history. Cumulative causation that he shared with Wicksell and Myrdal and others is something that Hirschman wrote a lot extensively about. Regional inequality dynamics. If Myrdal were working with backwash and spread effects, Hirschman was working with polarization and trickling down effects, that investment in one area could eventually lead to trickling down effects to others, and affecting each other in different ways. That is very much central in these studies today, and in economic geography, I would also say. Complementarities he referred to and discussed and contributed to the literature that Erik Dahmén and others were writing about in terms of development blocks and complementarities. Hirschman was one of those that is noteworthy, I think, scholar in that tradition as well. And also Herbert Simon and Freeman and Richard Nelson, and development as a learning process in itself that is very much part of innovation studies and entrepreneur studies of today, was something that he wrote extensively about also. Yes, so by wrapping up here, this is just a list of selected literature that if anybody thinks that they would like to study more, there are few of his most famous and well-known, well-read books are here. The ones that are underlined are a selection of essays that covers many things, and the others are monographs. And if you want to read biographies of him, there are two relatively, one very recent, I didn't know of that until I prepared for this. Albert Otto Hirschman, an intellectual biography by Michel Alashevich, that's an economic historian from Bologna, that just recently, I haven't read it, written a biography, and the great historian Jeremy Edelman wrote 2013 of a book called The Worldly Philosopher and the Odyssey of Albert Otto Hirschman. That could be well worth taking a look into, I think, if you're interested. I mean, Hirschman was my own inspiration to become an economic historian myself. So it was relatively nice, or it was nice to revisit these writings a little bit for this occasion. But I think my time is up there.
Yep, thank you. So much for the presentation. Very interesting, and the link also will be a food for discussion now on how to link it to economic history. We can take some question, and also I'm sitting with the computer, so if I don't know exactly to which camera to talk, but if you're online, you can also write the question in the chat. Is there any first questions? Yes, Ben?
Well, of course, I remember your excellent master essay on Hirschman 25 years ago. And then he was active 15 years beyond your essay. And so the last book of him you had here is from 1995, which was about the same time as you wrote your essay. So did he write anything of importance after the mid-90s?
I think there was one book called Crossing Boundaries that came, but that was more, perhaps, it was a book, but it was based on kind of an interview with lengthy answers. So he had some help in writing it, although it was his words, I think. But there weren't many very key contributions after that, I think. What I remember.
So you mentioned his work on development in Latin America, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on what was his relationships to other major theories of development in Latin America at the time. I don't know, for example, the Marxist variant or the traditional. I was just interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, very. I mean, very. I think Hirschman was very much. He was a left-leaning reformist, and just as he were skeptical towards big ideas on based on how to create market forces in the Milton Friedman kind of fashion that became popular in parts of Latin America. He was just as skeptical towards the more revolutionary ideas. He thought that, I mean, revolution was a part and parcel of the ideas of future of Latin America, particularly after Cuba, I think. There were dreamers in every country in Latin America. And he thought that was just, I think, wishful thinking, and it would never happen. I mean, the way forward was through reform. And one of his books, the second one here, Journeys Towards Progress, Studies of Policymaking in America, was considered by Hirschman as a kind of a handbook for policymakers in Latin America to try to better understand how change can happen through policymaking rather than grand ideas about, throwing society upside down and creating revolution. It was just a revolution was just a lack of imagination. It was you didn't know anything about the future, just that it should be completely different. It was unrealistic and childish, I think he thought. I think so. So he were just as skeptical towards the revolutionary Marxists as they were to the neoliberals, that both of them came to have great impression on policy making in Latin America, and he were trying to find some kind of middle way there between them.
So if I can just add a second question, how would he see like the idea of like social participation? Would it be more of an institutional thing, or would people create change by way of a social movement? And how does change come about in Hirschman's?
That's exactly the question he were preoccupied with, and he had many ideas on that. He was very interested in collective action, and he had another book here, Getting Ahead, fourth from the end here, Getting Ahead Collectively, Grassroots Experience in Latin America, for instance, was one study where he followed grassroots movements to see the scope and the possibilities of change coming from collective action or social action. All of his book touched upon that very question that you posed, I think. For instance, shifting involvements, private interest and public action were a book where he wanted to understand when and how private action matters, and when and how public action matters, and when they meet, and when they are shifting, why people are shifting to private individual behavior and that, or shifting into acting in social groups. So those were the mechanisms he wanted to understand, and he wanted to understand how that could also influence policy making. I think. So I think I cannot remember now exactly. I mean, he didn't go much for prescriptions of how to do it. There weren't any manuals of how to create change. It was just a more intellectual discussion of the process itself, I think.
Sorry. It's interesting because it's puzzling how he started as a policy advisor sent by whom to Latin America?
From US, I think.
From the United States, and he worked in military intelligence.
As an interpreter for German war criminals. So it was in the trials after World War II for.
And you listed anti-fascism as one of his guidelines. And I imagine that at some point he came into conflict with the United States policy in Latin America.
Yes.
And could you say something about that?
Well, first of all, he left working for the U.S. government was just when he arrived, just mid to late 40s, and then his academic career started in all those prestigious institutions. So he didn't work for that as far as I know. But he was also, I think, if you remember the John F. Kennedy doctrine in Latin America called the Alliance for Progress, where the US wanted to find certain reformist types as a middle way in Latin America to avoid revolutionary change, to avoid another Cuba. They were wanting these reformist people. I mean, Eduardo Frei, or in Chile, and which was a typical of this. And I think Hirschman, I think, shared that one should go for those reformists. But he had his doubts on all the from America imposed strategies that were implemented in Latin America, and he was a vivid and outspoken critic of all of them, particularly the ones that came from I mean the World Bank and these kind of market-oriented ideas that were never attached to reality. It was just, derivatives of how the economy should work according to theory, which he was a critic of anyway, I think.
Well, you mentioned things like cumulative causation and complementarities, and you mentioned Dallaire. So I wonder, what was his relation to Swedish economists? Did he, like Myrdal and Dallaire and others, did he refer to them? Did he have any correspondence with them?
I don't know. He referred to Myrdal and Hirschman were contemporaries, and they wrote about many, similar things. And they shared the cumulative causation and the spread backwash or polarization trickling down effects that they both elaborated on were they discussed with each other, or Hirschman at least discussed with Myrdal. I think he thought that he was similar to Myrdal, but he was a bit more optimistic than Myrdal. I mean, Myrdal's Asian drama wasn't the most optimistic book, and whereas Hirschman were more optimistic. He mentioned Damian, for instance, and when he wrote about the complementarities and development blocks, and he had similar ideas, but not in a kind of a Western world context, but rather in a policy making and developing world context. Yeah, I remember he also referred to other great, famous Swedish economists at the time, Staffan Burenstam Linder, and these people on trade theory and for instance, that he also discussed with. But I don't know if there was any direct
Did he visit Sweden to give lectures or something?
I don't know. I don't think so. He was apparently a very shy and quiet person. He didn't like to teach. He didn't like to give presentations. I've heard people sitting in the same conferences, and Hirschman never said anything. It was just like a quiet person sitting at the corner of the room. So he wrote very eloquently, and the prose is fantastic to read, but he didn't use that in his, although he was a very, he knew many languages. He was fluent in half a dozen of languages, for instance. But he wasn't demagogue or estradogue or whatever that's called, I think. So I don't think he visited. He weren't on any lecture tours anywhere, as far as I remember.
I would have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the concept of linkage is quite interesting. And I'm feeling that in understanding, like so you mentioned all of the fields that were influenced by Myrdal, including development, where industrialization is also very an important context. Industry, like industrial studies, are also quite interested in the concept of kind of an uneven growth, but also an industrialization process that is quite complex and that is linked to linkage, that can explain a bit what is kind of in the black box of industrialization. What I am seeing in the literature now is that the topic of industrialization is becoming more and more popular again, notably through how to cope with the environmental and social kind of objectives, is maybe through this kind of policy that would be socially and environmentally oriented also. And I think that his name is coming back in that discussion as well. So in this kind of revival of industrialization. But it seems like there was maybe a missed opportunity to understand even not only currently the industries for Europe, which is kind of where he's kind of becoming recognized as having potential, but also the past. So kind of past industrialization in Europe and in the West. And I was curious because it might just be that I don't know that there is work, but like economic historians, is there economic historian work using the linkage concept a lot inside of an understanding of the kind of industrial revolution and these kind of topic that we are interested in the department? So not only the past through development and then kind of developing countries, but also European countries.
Whether it's I don't know. I don't know the extent of that. I think it should be relevant, and I have come across it on an everyday basis in the discussion on developing countries, but I have not seen whether that is used for understanding Western industrialization with concepts of such as that. There might be, but I'm not aware of it. Maybe somebody else would know that. Jonas, you were studying industrialization in Western Europe. Have you come across linkage effect analysis on want to understand Sweden or Germany or France or Britain better.
Certainly there is, but you didn't ask whether Hirschman had applied this on European history.
No.
Or in general.
Whether they're as an analytical tools.
I think it isn't Sidney Pollard.
Yeah.
I could think of as using the linkage, and
That was probably in the 70s.
In the 70s, yes. And his most famous book is The Peaceful Conquest. There's at least very similar, as you mentioned as well, is Rostov's forward and backward linkages.
And maybe a follow-up question would be like, do you know, or do you think, except him being critical to sort of the mainstream economics, do you know why he is not used more? Is there also political elements when he was producing his work that would explain that?
In economics, you mean? I think, I mean, he's used as an example of a more heterodox economist by heterodox economists. And in mainstream economics, I think it's very much within the models and within the assumptions that are connected to neoclassical economics. I think there's not so much. I mean, it's not a career for an economist to use Hirschman's concept if you want to be make a career in economics. I think they're very much bounded by their own theories, and which is, I mean, Hirschman was more of a. He wanted to add other aspects in. I mean, in terms of that, you can say that Herbert Simon and others is part of mainstream economics. I think that's then Hirschman would go into that. But otherwise, the whole idea and his whole research agenda was to find connections and use insights from other disciplines in order to understand how change happened. So he didn't pay much attention to equilibrium, for instance, because that was more of a system of non-change. He wanted to understand when you're moving from different equilibrium to another, which is part of, I mean, evolutionary economics and those kind of sub-disciplines, but not very much neoclassical economics.
I could imagine that Krugman's the fall and rise of development economics, where he at the same time admires or give credits to Hirschman, but in the end find him representing something irrelevant, and this is why development economics in the eyes of Krugman collapsed. And then first when models were put into development economics, it rose again. So, but it's a very readable little paper by Krugman.
I remember that one too, where he said that Hirschman was interesting but useless. I think Roderick, on the other hand, he thinks that, and he's been revisiting Hirschman a lot lately, I think, and he says that I mean, development where it happens in the world, it doesn't happen because of good development policies. Development policies is useless but development takes place anyway. And then he has this correlation that the countries that are following the prescriptions of mainstream development policy are the ones that, you know, have the lowest progress of development. So he thinks that there's a lot in Hirschman that can be used to improve the policy-making programs and policy-making process. So that's another take. I mean, Roderick is, after all, in mainstream economics. He's very much part of mainstream, although he has his own. He's at the borderlines always. He's actually part of mainstream economics, and he thinks that, on the other hand, that Hirschman is something that we should make better use of, I think.
But if I have a follow-up, then I mean, there's an implicit understanding that is through reform, and reform has to be for Hirschman. No? I mean, he's not a historian in that sense. He's interested in change, but there's no periodization. So I guess at any potential time, you could reform. So then there has to be some degree of intention in policy for reform to happen, or enable maybe the grassroots. I mean, there must be some degree of result of policy, isn't it? Or he didn't, is necessary but not, or how does it?
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I mean, that's a valid reflection. I think when you are at it, then things are revealed that you didn't know before that, and then you have to work with that to see what you can, and then it's a possibility that the outcome will be unexpected.
Okay, exactly.
Yeah.
The concept of trespassing is new to me in this context. Can you explain what he meant by that?
Well, it was one of the titles of this book there, Essays in Trespass. I mean, it's crossing borders into other disciplines, basically. I think
but you're not supposed to be there. Trespassing.
Well, yes.
You're entering somewhere you're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
Allowed
That's probably true, and he thought that was the thing that was wrong with the social sciences. You should allow more trespassing, but that was also the reason why he was criticized for, but also in awe, depending on who yeah.
It's more accepted today.
I think it is. I mean, today we are, as I said in the beginning, I think we are increasingly urged to do cross-disciplinary research, and the problems and challenges that society is faced with requires different angles. And I think this is one. That's also one reason why this could be. This type of research and this type of scholarly hybridism is something that could be stimulating and useful, possibly.
Time is almost up, so if there is no final question, maybe we can give another applause. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you, Clara. And thank you.